we go ahead and get started then? Thanks everyone for joining this webinar. My name is Angel Hsu. I'm an assistant professor of public policy and the environment, also the founder and director of the Data-Driven EnviroLab. And I'm joined with me tonight with by my colleagues, Kaihui Song, who is a postdoctoral associate also at DDL and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Mark Roelfsema, who is a researcher at Utrecht University, and Katherine Burley, who's a PhD student also at UNC. And today we have the pleasure of launching our 5th edition of our 2023 Global Climate Action Report, Climate Ambition of Cities, Regions, and Companies. So we'll take about 35 minutes to go over some of the highlights of this report, and then hopefully that will leave time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom, which is at the bottom, and we'll do our best to get to questions. Okay, Kaihui, if you can go to the next slide.
Sure.
As I mentioned, this is the 5th series of our reports in the Global Climate Action of Cities, Regions, and Businesses. We started this work in 2018 when former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, along with then California Governor Jerry Brown, hosted the first Global Climate Action Summit as a rallying charge for subnational governments, businesses, financial institutions, civil society organizations, and individuals to fill in gaps in climate action that were being left by national governments. And so we came together as part of the CAMDA climate analysis and data community to actually put together and collect all of the data on what subnational governments were doing in 10 high emitting countries, along with companies in these countries that were reporting to CDP, which is the largest disclosure platform for climate related action and information. And so developing methods to analyze and aggregate what these different actors were doing, we developed the first analysis that was presented at the Global Climate Action Summit in 2018 to answer the question, what are non-state and subnational actors doing on climate change? And are their efforts actually more ambitious than national governments? And can it lead to additional reductions that can actually help to narrow the emissions gap? And so we've now published, this is the 5th of these reports. And this year we did things a little bit different. And so you're getting kind of a sneak peek at the full arc of the key messages and analysis that we're preparing. So for September, we are now presenting an overview of different non-state and subnational climate actions in the G20 this year, and also looking at the ambition of what they pledged. And then in November, right before COP28, we'll look at the progress that these different actors have made and also what results they've achieved. If we can go to the next slide. And just a little bit of context before I turn over to Kaihui, who will dive into some of the more meaty findings of this year's report. Just to give you a little bit of context, we're doing this webinar on the heels of last week's Climate Week, which was in line with the UN General Assembly meeting. And for the first time on last Wednesday, there was a Climate Ambition Summit to talk about one, current state of ambition of national governments primarily, but then also how subnational and non-state actors can help to fill in gaps in ambition. And this is really critical because in the last few years, there have been increasing calls for greater scrutiny of business and also city, state, and region climate actions. And that's signified by this Integrity Matters report that was published last year at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And that followed on a year-long process where the UN Secretary General convened a high-level expert group to develop standards and guidelines for net zero integrity to ensure the credibility and the robustness of subnational and non-state actors' climate pledges, particularly on net zero. And then this year, we have, for the first time, included a time series look so we can actually evaluate how different non-state and subnational climate actions have progressed, particularly in terms of ambition. So that's the context for this report. And I'll turn over to Kaihui now, who will dive into some of our particular results on cities and regions. Kaihui?
Yeah, sure. I'll be presenting the progress in subnational climate actions on behalf of our collective efforts from our great team of Data-Driven Environment Lab, contributed to the preparation of this report. So in our subnational analysis in this report, we expanded our analysis to G20 countries from our previous report of G13 countries. And as shown in this map, supranational climate actors from these G20 countries represent about 80% of the global GDP, 60% of the global population, and about 75 to 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And we narrowed our focus solely on these actors who have pledged the quantifiable mitigation targets and the net zero and carbon neutrality targets. So in our analysis, the quantifiable targets are those like actors has specified and provide information on their baseline year and baseline emissions. They have a reduction target, a target year, say, because cities, regions, and companies, they have established this like measurable goals. They are more likely to be implementing the real actions. And from our map, we can see that in our analysis, there are more than 3,000 cities and 175 regions have made quantifiable emission reduction targets by the end of 2022. And these supranational actors account for 2.1 million people around the world, representing about 27% of the total global population, accounting for the geographical overlaps. Cities and regions in these G20 countries have set about 3,800 quantifiable emission targets. And we can also see more than 500 actors set more than one target. When we look at the population and the target share that are covered by our quantifiable emission targets, we can see that for the regional actors cover about 1.65 billion people, and the city level actors contributed another 455 million population coverage. And so this pie chart breakdown showed that in terms of population coverage, East Asia, South Asia together contribute to about 70% population coverage, while another 10% of the population coverage are from European countries. In terms of the targets, number of targets, after accounting for all the targets in terms of the quantifiable targets, about 3/3 of the targets are from cities and the regions in Europe, and followed by 10% from North America and another about 10% from East Asia and the Pacific areas. We dive into the progress in the participation of this supranational global climate actions. The good news that from last year, we have seen a growing participation from cities and the regions. And we also noticed a growing participation from the developing countries, such as India, Brazil, China, and Mexico. We also observed the increasing participation from the developed nations. For example, the UK, Australia, US, Canada, and Argentina. But we also noticed that more EU cities and the regions are pledging after 2022, but still haven't rebounded at the level before the 2020 level. The progress in supranational target setting, from this target setting, we can see on the right side figure, the targets, we have the targets divided by short-term targets, mid-term targets, and the long-term targets. For all these G20 countries, most of the quantifiable climate targets pledged are mid-term targets in the middle, account for like more than 70%, followed by the long-term targets, which contributed about 23%, while short-term targets remain the least, about 5%. And cities and regions in the US and Canada pledged more long-term targets. Nearly half of the targets are long-term targets, while the actors in EU countries pledged more mid-term targets. About more than 80% of the targets are mid-term targets. It's shown here. So in post-2020, over 70% of the EU actors did not see a new target after 2020. while only 23% of these actors are still reporting quantifiable targets in this year's report. We also look at the net zero targets. In our report, we included not only net zero targets, but also the actors that plan to achieve carbon neutrality, zero emissions, and 1% emission reductions. So all of them are labeled as net zero targets. And from our analysis, we identified about 570 net zero targets from these G20 subnational actors. More than 60% of the net zero targets are set at 2050. We also identified more than 400 net zero targets from cities and 130 net zero targets from regions. So we found that just under half of the cities and the regions with net zero targets also have an interim reduction targets. And these actors are mainly from the East Asia and Pacific, primarily from Japan and also North America. We also noticed a higher percentage of subnational governments in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, and the Caribbean regions have only standalone net zero targets without interim targets. We also delve into the emission pathways for the time series data. While this figure shows only the past year's data collection, which is a disclosure year of 2020 for the subnational emission pathways. In this pathway modeling, we included about 3,000 cities and 140 regions, covered about 10 gigaton carbon dioxide emissions with standardized emission to 2022, representing about 27% of the global emissions. And together with these emission and ambition targets, these subnational actors together aim to reduce about 9 gigaton emissions by 2060. However, we noticed that although subnational emission pathways show that cities and the regions have been increasing their ambition over the efforts over time, they are kind of falling short of the pace that is required for the 1.5 degree goal, which is to have the emission by 2030 and net zero by 2050. When looking at the time series, we found that while this year we definitely include more actors that pledge net zero targets. And from this analysis, we can see that since 2020, cities and the regions from the G10 countries, in this analysis, the G10 countries have been consistently analyzed throughout our 5 climate action reports. And these G10 countries have been making progress in their ambition to emission reduction. Cities and the regions' collective efforts indicate they have pledged to reduce emission at higher speed than previous years, as we can show that for the latest year 2022, both the regions and the cities, the slope is higher and the coverage of emission is higher as well. So I will hand it over to Mark for the company part. Oh, sorry, am I frozen? You're muted, Mark.
Yes, thanks. This is still your slide. Oh, yeah, okay. This one. Thanks, companies. So, yeah, thank you, Kaihui, for the overview of the cities and regions. So I'll now present the results for companies, which are similar but different, I would say. The rough conclusions are the same, but of course there are many differences. I will start actually with the results from the last year's report, where we specifically looked at progress and comparing them with ambition. And there we saw that actually around 75% of the companies were already on track to meet their self-reported targets. And 42.25% were even in line with 1.5 degrees. However, variation was still high, and it was actually only based on average 2 years of targets that were being alive at that moment. And it only included scope 1 and 2. So next slide, please. So corporate climate action. So as with cities and regions, we will show you the voluntary reduction targets, only absolute emission reduction targets, and the covered emissions. So this whole assessment was based on CDP disclosure, so companies self-reporting emissions and targets and other information to CDP. And we include all the 2018 to 25 disclosure years. So it's a period of 5 years where we compare ambition included in these targets. And as said, we only include emission, absolute emission reduction targets and not intensity or other targets. I think around 40 to 45% of the companies do not include any targets. And of these 40 to 45%, most of them, around 80%, have an absolute emission target. So what kind of numbers are we talking about? So in 2022, 8,300 companies reported to CDP, which was only 2,600 in 2018. So that was it's quite a large increase of companies reporting to CDP. And of these 8,300 companies, 2,800 companies have reported these absolute emission targets, absolute reduction targets, which was only 965 in 2018. And these companies that were included in total had 4,900 targets, which was only 1,650 in 2018. If we look in terms of revenue, in 2018, this was roughly 15.4 trillion, and now increased to 27.4 trillion. Note, however, this is only a kind of lower end estimate because we were only able to get revenues for the exchange traded companies. And if you would put this in context, currently China, all exchange traded companies in China have roughly 31 billion revenue, and the US it's 23. Next, please, next slide. So in general, we see an increasing number of targets and also an increasing number of companies pledging these targets. We can look at this from different angles. For example, country branches. So in general, of course, a company has one headquarter located in one country, but is operating in different country branches. If we would count every company target for the country branch, we get to between 5,000 and 15,000 G20 country branch targets. So this is 5,000 in 2018 and 15,000 in 2022. The general trend is that all number of targets are increasing throughout the disclosure years from 2018 to 2022. And especially the midterm targets are most popular. This is kind of similar with cities and regions. And the short-term targets are also relatively popular, while long-term targets have the lowest number of targets, although they are also still increasing. And this is similar for all 4 countries that are shown here: China, EU, India, and US. But in the appendix, you can also find the other G20 targets, or G20 countries. Well, we can also look from a sector perspective, and then we look at the number of companies that are pledging targets in each sector. It's clear that in all disclosure years, services and manufacturing have the highest number of companies pledging these targets. And except for one sector, the trend is increasing from 2008 to 2022. Only in the power generation, we see a kind of stabilizing trend where number of companies that are pledging is kind of stable since 2019. Next slide, please. Well, another perspective is, of course, to look at the total scope 1 plus 2 targets, or separately to scope 3 targets. Let's first look at the scope 1 and 2 targets. So this can either be targets that cover scope 1 and 2, or one of the two. And as you see in the left target, it's around 65% that cover both scopes, and the other remaining is either one of the two, or also includes scope 3 targets. We see the same trend as for sectors and country branches. It's an increasing trend for both number of targets and number of companies that are pledging these targets in the different disclosure years. And in total, this covers in 2018 a bit above 2 gigaton CO2 equivalent emissions, but now in 2022 already more than 5 gigaton. And also to put this into context, this is kind of roughly the same as what the US was emitting in 2022, 5.3 gigaton CO2 equivalent emissions. Note, however, that we have not adjusted for overlap. So scope 1 emissions for electricity companies can be scope 1 for other companies. And this is something we have to do in future reports. Then we've also looked at scope 3 targets. This was actually the first time that we did this in the 5 years that we are already producing these reports. And actually, we always said that scope 3 is actually very important because for most companies, actually the scope 3 emissions are a few factors larger than the scope 1 plus 2 targets. Of course, they need very different reduction strategies, such as engagement or changing suppliers, but they can also produce different or make their products less CO2 efficient, so clients have less emissions. If we look at these the trend for scope 3, we also see an increasing trend both in companies and targets. And it's specifically clear or nice to see that in 2018, most companies only had one scope 3 targets, but they are gradually changing to more targets. So not only short or mid-term, but also longer targets for scope 3. If we look at the emission trends, it started for about roughly 3 gigaton CO2 equivalent in 2018, and it's now more than 20 gigaton CO2 equivalent emissions. Of course, also here we did not account for overlap, which is also not straightforward because their scope 1 emissions can be scope 3 emissions for others and vice versa, and also for different countries. So that's difficult to entangle, but we will, of course, try in the near future. There is a small dip. We're not exactly sure in emissions, but we think that is due to the COVID period at the end of 2021. Yes, Ness. And also for the first time, we have looked at net zero targets in this report. It's actually only since 2021 that companies are reporting their net zero targets to CDP. So we only have 2021 and 2022 in our data set. Also here, we see a sharp increase in net zero targets between 2021 and 2022, especially in the manufacturing services sector. There, they are the most companies that set these targets. The only thing is that in this change from 2021 to 2022, although we see more targets, they have set their net zero target on average a bit further. So instead of the average was 2041 in 2021 disclosure, but increased to 2044. And it's a service sector that is actually has the closest net zero target, which is around 2040. Note that we are still not exactly clear if this only covers CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas or full greenhouse gas emissions. It should be the last, but these net zero targets are actually linked to a multiple of targets, so they can set absolute intensity and portfolio targets, and all these targets together should make these net zero targets happen. Yes, next slide, please. So this is the final slide of at least of the analysis of corporate climate actions. Just like with cities and regions, we have also aggregated all the emissions to make pathways. So we took the base year emissions, target year emissions, which can be multiple, and created a pathway for every company, and then aggregated it to a total. For this, we made kind of two data sets. First, we made emission pathways for all the companies in each disclosure year. And then second, we made a data set for all the companies that consistently reported in all the disclosure years. So in 2018 to 2022. So they reported in all 5 years. So we made these emission projections until 2050, but only 25% of the companies actually have targets beyond 2030. So this means that for at least 75% of the targets, we needed to extrapolate the emissions after the final target year. And we did this using the current policy scenario from the image model. So what do we see in these, and what can we conclude from these graphs? So on the left, for all companies, we see that consistently emissions increase from 2020 to in 2020. This is, of course, mainly due to the increasing number of companies that are pledging targets. At the same time, we see an increasing reduction between 2020 and 2030. While this is only around 16% in the 2018 disclosure years, it increases, or it almost doubles to 33% between 2020 and 2030 in the 2022 disclosure year. So this is an encouraging trend, I would say. We roughly see the same trend also for the consistent companies. It's actually even a bit more. They reduce 38% in 2022. And here we actually see a decreasing trend in 2020 emissions. So this can be either due to because they have made a lot of progress, have made more ambitious targets, but it could also be that they have changed their base year emissions. So this is actually, this needs further research to really show why this trend is decreasing in 2020 for consistent companies. Well, this was all the good news, although it's an increasing trend, ambition is increasing. However, these companies still do not reach net zero around 2050. Because most of these companies do not have any 2050 or beyond 2030 targets, and we also need more companies pledging these 2050 targets. We've done the same analysis for different sectors. So the largest energy-intensive sectors, chemical, iron and steel, and non-metallic. We see kind of the same trend there. However, it only appeared the last 2 or 3 years. In the first few disclosure years, ambition was actually lacking. Yes, next, please. So now we come to the conclusions for all the cities, regions, and companies. So it starts actually with an encouraging trend. The number of cities, regions, and companies that pledge these climate mitigation goals has increased globally. But they are primarily aiming to reduce emissions within the midterm. So longer term trends are there, but still lacking. For companies, we see this trend consistent between country branches, scopes, and sectors. Both for companies, cities, and regions, we see also an increasing net zero and carbon neutrality target. Well, then we start off with more bad news. Although this is all increasing, so the number of targets and also ambition, it's still not enough for the pace required to align with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. Yes, next one, please. So Angel started off with the Climate Ambition Summit. We have published this on the heels of this summit. It's also was input last week. We already published the executive summary. And according to the Secretary General, this was the summit of hope. And he wanted to show that he actually said that first doers and movers can already do it. There's companies, cities, regions, but also countries pledging net zero. Well, now everybody should actually copy that, not only to reach climate goals, but also sustainable development goals. And he has showcased a way forward. So sectoral, local, national, international plans and policies should be aligned with the net zero goals. They should be credible and science-backed in order to accelerate this for decarbonization. We need more climate justice and fairness, and we need unprecedented levels of coordination and cooperation, which again leads to renewed focus on credibility and accountability. Well, this is actually kind of a nice summary of what our recommendations are also. So on the next slide, please, you can see what our recommendations are from this report. Cities, regions, and companies really need to increase near-term ambition to help accelerate needed transitions to keep 1.5 degrees goal alive. And well, it's good news that overall climate emissions from cities, regions, and companies is increasing. The pace of ambition must accelerate, and this should also include more net zero targets and a broader participation of cities, regions, and companies, especially from the global south. We see that net zero target setting isn't a new established norm, which is also good, but we also need interim targets where these actors show how they will achieve these net zero targets. And finally, we need a greater alignment with national governments, so cooperation between non-state and subnational actors and governments to achieve the net zero conveyor belt to just increase emission towards the Paris goals. Thank you. Yeah, so also acknowledgement. Data-driven lab and CDP and we Utrecht University have made this report, but we thank a lot Takeshi, Sibrich, Frederik of New Climate Institute who provided valuable guidance throughout the whole report process. And then many people from Data-Driven Lab helped develop the City and Region database, Siyi, Nagin, Davin, Antao, Xian, and Jiqi Lu. And especially thanks to Mark Roelfsema and Paulina Korniva, who helped us, or who actually designed the whole report and all the figures. And communication, of course, is important. So Charlotte Ballard from Utrecht University and Natalie Short and Aline Vetters from Data-Driven Lab helped us with the communication. And this was all supported by the IKEA Foundation. I think there's one slide. Well, thank you. And if you want to download the report, you can just scan the QR code and have a look. But it's also available on the Data-Driven and Copernicus Utrecht University website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark and Kaihui. And as you're preparing your questions, please use the Q&A function. I'm going to take moderators.
I don't hear you, Angel.
Oh, no. Oh,
no. You're not muted.
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay. Mark, can you hear me?
No.
Still cannot? But Katherine, you can?
I can hear you too.
Okay, so you can hear me. Yeah. So Mark, I maybe Katherine, can you
chat?
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. So now it's okay. So please, I'm already seeing the questions roll in, but I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask a first question to the panelists. And we also are joined by Andrew Clapper from CDP. So anyone can really join in and answer and share your viewpoints. So there was a lot of really rich data and analysis that was presented. And it seems like on one hand, on subnationals, you have a lot of cities and states that are setting long-term targets, or they've committed to carbon neutrality through one of these many initiatives like the Race to Zero campaign, the Cities Climate Neutrality Alliance, for example. But then a lot of them are not matched with these interim targets, more near term, that would suggest more credibility. And then it seems like, on the other hand, companies are a little bit different, where they're setting a lot more short-term and mid-term targets, but then not anything beyond 2030. So that's one observation. And then the second observation is that we're seeing all these positive trends in target setting and also in net zero target setting, but then emissions still keep going up. And so I want to pose to the panelists, based on this analysis, would you say that you're more optimistic and the glass is half full, or are you less optimistic about climate actions coming from this diversity of non-state and subnational actors? So this is to the whole panel. Anyone can jump in.
I'll go first. In my opinion, for at least from the data in the subnational side, I'm pretty positive that we have based on the trend that we observed, that more actors participated in this climate commitment and more targets are set, like through this time series analysis. But as we can see also from the report, that only about half of the actors only pledged for the net zero, have set the interim targets based on they already have a net zero targets. So because for the subnational actors, it's important to reduce their emissions, but if they have interim targets and more step-by-step action planned, and then we'll be more likely to be implementing these actions and strategies step by step. So from the subnational side, I would say more positive, but more actions are needed in terms of achieving these targets, which is also will be have a little bit analysis in our November report to delve into these actors, their performance and their achievements so far.
Yes, well, it's actually a challenging question, and I think also for us, I think it was important that we would, because it's always this news that we need more and more, and we needed. We also wanted to show there's not nothing. There are cities, regions, and companies are doing and increasing ambition. So there's definitely things on the table that you could call positive news. But in the end, I think it's still not enough. So for me, then the glass is still half empty, because it's, although we need more cooperation, we need more targets, we need more also justice and fairness. So there's too much that we still need in the near future and very quickly. So although it's good news, half empty, I would say.
Katherine or Andrew, do you want to add in any additional thoughts to what Mark and Kaihui have shared?
Yeah, I think the results on the target terms this year were quite interesting, like you mentioned, with the difference between the subnational governments and companies. And to me, I think that almost indicates more of an half-empty glass, because I think we see a lot of clusters of target terms around 2030, or which is a midterm target, or 2050 with no interim targets, and that might indicate that even though we're seeing ambition increasing, maybe these targets are set kind of based on peer standards between cities and regions, and setting a goal based on what others have done and not actually having a credible plan. So we don't see as many short-term targets, even though we know that short-term goals are achievable, maybe because so many actors are setting 2030 targets and everyone just thinks, okay, we'll set a 2030 target too. So to me, I think that's more of a half-empty outlook, but it'll be interesting to see when those terms roll around, if people are working towards action for those years, or if they are setting them based on peer pressure.
Yeah, and actually that's a really great segue into a question that Chester asked. So he asked, I was wondering whether the company's results of setting more net zero targets in 2021 are related to the launch of SBTI. So for folks who are not familiar, that's the Science-Based Targets Initiative release of the net zero standard. So I think that goes back to Katherine's point about whether or not the science or these standards that are emerging to better guide non-state subnational climate actions may have influence. So that's the first part of Chester's question. And then the second part is, and if so, are the results from this GCA report being actively shared with institutions such as SBTI and thus catalyzing more corporate action and target setting? So actually, I'm going to pose that second question to Andrew, but then maybe Mark, you want to take the first part of that question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's actually a good remark. And I think it's even broader than that, because if you look at as SBTI, they first started with 2-degree targets. Then they gradually also included 1.5 degrees, and now also net zero. And that's actually kind of aligns exactly with the progress you see in our data set. Of course, CDP is one of the partners in the Science-Based Targets Initiative, so it's probably not, there's a very high correlation there. So yes, I definitely think that this SBTI standard has catalyzed corporate ambition a lot, and hopefully actually now national governments such as the regions such as the EU and US are now actually making it, putting it into law. It will even accelerate even further. But yeah, that's hope. But I think also that will work out in the next few years.
Andrew, yep.
Yeah, I can build on that. And apologies, I'm unable to start my video for some reason, so that's why you can't see me at the moment. But I think the trend for companies has been more short-term, medium-term target setting. That was kind of the standard that SBTI had set in the last few years. So I do think with Race to Zero, with kind of the increase in a focus on net zero targets, we are going to see that change with the SBTI standard as well. So yeah, I would agree that it seems like between cities and regions and companies, there were different approaches. I think there is more cohesion now in terms of like long-term planning, and companies being pressed to make some of those long-term commitments towards net zero. So yeah, with only 2 years of data so far in the CDP responses, I think this will be a trend that continues to increase going forward. I can also say that just in terms of like total number of companies disclosing, we've been seeing a real increase year on year in the past few years, almost exponential growth in disclosure. So I think, whereas there's been a period where there were a lot of companies leading the way, setting these targets, this is now becoming much more mainstream, and it's starting to cover many, many more companies. And yeah, I think that's, at least in terms of setting ambition and having these targets and having a starting place to begin progressing towards those goals, I think that's encouraging.
Great. And I think you can turn on your video now, Andrew. Kaihui made you a co-host. Okay, great. Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is really focused more on the subnational side. So I'll ping this to Katherine and to Kaihui. So the question is, did you look in this edition of the report at the context of subnational actors? So for example, which countries and the country context, to see if there is a coupling of ambition or target setting between them, or rather a diverging trend? So yeah, this is quite an interesting question. So Kaihui or Katherine, do you have any thoughts on this particular one?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Katherine. Oh, okay. So for the subnational actors, whether there's a decoupling trend between ambition and target setting, between ambition target, I would say, like, in our analysis, we only included the actors that pledged to reduce emissions. For some of the actors that pledge to achieve like peak emissions, or have some other type of targets, for example, the emission intensity target, and these are not as measurable as we have those quantifiable targets in our report. And if there's, in terms of ambitions and targets between their, in terms of the trend between ambitions and emissions, I would say most of them are still on the path based on our interpolation and extrapolation. However, we are also not sure, because for the self-reported emission from the subnational actors, it's a mix of different scope of emissions. So the trend, because of the lack of standardization and mix of a scope and the type of greenhouse gases, it's a little bit hard to tell the trend in a consistent way, to be honest.
I can just add, this is a really interesting question, and I don't think we have looked to see the relationship between ambition and target setting at the country level, which I think maybe this is asking about, which is really interesting. We can do that a little more. We definitely look a lot at the country context for target setting. So like a couple interesting findings, we look at countries that have really comprehensive coverage of targets from some national governments. So for example, Australia, the UK, and Japan have almost like 100% of their populations covered by subnational government targets. And we do spend a lot more time talking about target setting within different countries. But one interesting finding that might speak to kind of ambition and target setting is what we saw in the EU. So the EU has a lot of small actors that have set targets. So they are always kind of the farthest ahead in terms of the number of targets. But we have noticed, as Kaihui mentioned in her portion of the presentation, that they have not set nearly as many targets as they did prior to 2020. So they were really, really active, and that has dropped off. And even though it's increasing, it just really hasn't gotten back to the same level. And we also saw that the increase in targets from the EU this year is lower than all of the other countries that we looked at, and that they're really lagging behind in setting net zero targets. So that was one kind of finding, along with ambition and target setting, that we did see within one country context, but would be interesting to look at this more in future reports.
Yeah, and I would just add, Kaihui, you have this one interesting statistic in the ambition pathway section talking about how in countries like United States, China, and I can't remember the last country, but the regional actors only make up 40, 30, and 20% of national ambition or emissions, excuse me. And so I think that's also a really interesting stat to answer this question, because you can see that at least the United States and China, they have made pledges for net zero carbon neutrality by 2050 and 2060. And clearly the regional ambition doesn't necessarily align. So I think you have some of those contexts, large countries, that where there is this mismatch in ambition. But then you have some of those examples that Katherine mentioned. I think also in the report we talk about Australia, and how actually it was the 8 Australian states that first made net zero pledges, and that kind of catalyzed the national government to then follow suit. And you also see some of those patterns. And so that, I think, feeds back into Mark's point about this net zero conveyor belt, where we need to see more alignment to make sure that, yeah, there are not actors that are left behind, or some of them that are actually really lagging, because we need kind of everyone on board and contributing their efforts in order to actually achieve net zero. So I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A, but yeah, Mark, did you want to add? Yeah.
Because it's actually work in progress that we are currently doing. My colleague Chelsea Jones at University, where we look at the interaction between cities and national governments, and it's still work in progress. So I also have to get it from the back of my mind. But I think especially if it's, for example, city funding is kind of secured in law or regulation, then that helps a lot for cities. And one thing that was actually, it was out of the scope, but this is an interesting thing, that if there are strong regional, like in the US, and I'm not sure what the other was, I think India, where they have ambitious targets, then actually cities think they can do less. So there is all kinds of interactions between different levels going on there. And I think that's definitely something we have to look into further.
That's super interesting. Andrew, do you want to weigh in on the corporate perspective and whether you're seeing some of this corporate catalytic impact on national governments or vice versa?
I think it's really challenging on the corporate side because so many companies are working in many different countries. So yeah, that's another area I think we have discussed a little bit. That's an area to expand into, as sort of more of like a spatial analysis of what companies are doing, looking at their country level emissions inventories and trying to see how maybe they're implementing their net zero targets, or just targets in general across different geographies. I think that would be a first step, and then maybe that could open up interesting questions around whether we're seeing the impacts of say like national targets or policies, different regional policies, national policies, and how that might be influencing how corporations are pursuing their targets. But yeah, I think that's sort of a next step that relies on, again, like the data quality, the reporting, the standardization, and yeah, there's definitely a lot of challenges in terms of trying to map those sort of just the different boundaries that companies have, the way companies can change their boundaries, through mergers, acquisitions, etc. It makes some of the time series analysis of the corporate targets very challenging. But that's something that we'll need to explore more in the future in order to better understand what's happening across the globe.
Thank you. That's certainly been a theme, I think, of this panel, is how complex the data are, how incomplete, and how we wish that they were really consistent and comprehensive across the board. So we have another question from Joshin. Could you share what might be the main drivers of the target escalation of subnational actors and countries in a specific region or country in 2022?
Based on the subnational action, based on this observation, I would say different countries take different approaches. For example, some countries like Japan, it's more like a bottom-up driven approach where more cities and regions pledge net zero targets ahead of the national pledge. So it's really that subnational actions drive this more ambitious and widespread emission reduction nationwide. But for other countries, for example, like China, it's more like a top-down approach where the national government set a target, the net zero target, peak emission target, and there's a 1+N policies that different subnational actors, governments started to develop their own like more detailed policy to be in line with the national emission reduction targets. So I would say different countries take different approaches. And there are definitely other drivers, for example, that all the momentum that all the countries are making net zero pledges, which some cities and regions feel the peer pressure to make a similar commitment and develop their emission reduction targets.
Mark, thank you. Mark, do you cover drivers in that paper that you just mentioned with Chelsea? Is that something that you look into?
Yeah, as again, I think it's not really the drivers, but more the correlation. But what kind of if there a law, what kind of funding do they get? How ambitious is the target? So in that sense, but yeah, you could call that drivers support. But then especially the drivers for cities to act on climate based on their interaction with national government.
Great, thank you. So we just have a few minutes left. And so I'm going to also, wait, okay, sorry, we have another question. I was going to ask one, but we have another question. Okay, this question is from Natalie. Why do you think, I think this is probably targeted to Katherine, why do you think the EU has been slower to rebound after COVID in terms of target setting? Great question. Katherine, do you have any hypotheses?
That is a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think my hypothesis would be that because there was such momentum around 2020 targets, maybe there's a sense that action was achieved. And now I don't know why that hasn't translated into like net zero target setting. But I think maybe it was just such like grew momentum around 2020. And then perhaps a shift in focus because of COVID, that just the combination of those things has dampened future efforts in the EU. But that's just my guess. I don't know. It'd be interesting to look into that more.
Kaihui, did you want to add any additional thoughts?
One additional note I can add is it looks like before 2020, because most of the targets are set at 2020, and those targets are expired by the 2020, and they started to make more like midterm targets by 2030. but maybe devising this policies takes time, and the policy makers, the national governments, just recover from the COVID pandemic and taking time to make this more credible and actionable plans may need some time. But after 2020 to 2023, like these 3 years, it has a slow recovery of the target setting for the EU subnational actors.
I could maybe add a little bit, just that
yeah.
Not specifically on EU cities and regions, but I know in general through the pandemic that a lot of subnational actors were really struggling, facing a lot of other crises, and I think resourcing was definitely an issue. And in response, for instance, the reporting period, like the date by which subnational actors needed to respond to CDP, was greatly extended and has been, kind of held as like the end of the year, which is quite different from companies. So, at least, in terms of actors that we were asking to disclose, there was feedback that they didn't have the resourcing to do that. So my guess is there was kind of a diversion of resources to address, the COVID pandemic, and that might have, kind of slowed down some of the target setting or their ability to focus on that and plan on that for a couple of years.
Yeah, I think certainly in some of the analysis that we've done on cities participating in the EU Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which is the largest transnational climate initiative in EU, the median size of a city participating is 30,000 people. So I think Andrew and Kaihui and Katherine, I think you're right, where you're talking about really small cities and towns in Europe that were pledging those 2020 targets. And so, I mean, I think definitely bread and butter issues probably came to the fore. And as Kaihui mentioned, it's challenging to come up with these plans and to do it in a credible way. So I think it's probably a confluence of a lot of those factors. Okay, well, I think we're actually out of time and I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, but as Mark mentioned, or Kaihui, I don't know if you can put up the screen with the QR code. We would love for you to take a look at the report and give us any additional feedback. Feel free to email us directly or reach out to our social media. Again, thank you so much for participating in this webinar, and thanks so much to our panelists for giving us a really fantastic overview of the results. And all I can say is stay tuned. The second half is coming, so we hope that you can give us your feedback before then, so we can make sure we can include those answers in the November report and preempt them. So thank you, and I hope everybody has a great day wherever you are.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.